And I got that from an archaeological site in Somerset. And you can see it's just little broken bits of charcoal because it was burned, because it turned to compost. It'll decay if there's moisture. So it has to be burned or waterlogged, so there's no oxygen, like in a peat bog, or it's dried. And this thatch has survived because it's dry. And it is, it's up in the top, in the top of a roof. They didn't have a first floor. They didn't have a chimney. So the smoke just goes up, covers it with black, which is why it's there, and that preserves it. I've looked at the wheat from, and other things from King Tutankhamun's tomb, and that was really dry. And the seed was intact, but it wouldn't germinate because, yes, everyone says seeds, a wheat seed, a cereal seed, only live for about 5 years. I don't think I've had wheat seed that has lived more than 5 years without me freezing it. So if it's frozen, that's fine. Even then, 15 to 20 years, you still have to grow it again. And that's why we've lost so much of the wheat, of our diversity from the past. But you read stories about people, I germinated seed from ancient Egyptian tombs, or there was a thing about, someone said they found rye, the Finnish rye up in Finland in a house, or was it a Swedish house, that had been abandoned for 100 years. And they went into this house and they found under the floorboards 9 grains of rye, and like 2 of them grew. How is rye going to last for 100 years in a damp Swedish building where there's mice and bugs and compost and fungi? And a grain is it's like a car running on petrol. If you're not driving anywhere, but the engine's still running, the battery will die even if you don't use it. And that's like a seed. So you can't resurrect that. I can't grow this, but I can go to the gene bank and find something very similar to it. And that's what I've been doing. Sorry.
No, I was really fascinated when you were talking about the Finnish rye, because I really am interested about the story of the rye of the forest Finns.
Yeah, the forest Finns. Yeah.
I don't know how to say it. Bi-yearly, that they put it into the ash of the forest they cut down, and then it takes 2 years to actually grow, but it has several straws and lots of grain, and it's super heavy. And
that's like I was saying earlier when I was talking about the mustard in that field I grew. I said was the best wheat field I'd ever grown. So if you, I think what they do is they cut down, from what I understand, they cut down all the bushes and trees, or they used to, and then burn it, and that's in June, July. So that's the first year, and then it grows through the winter and then produces these bushes. But every wheat will do that. So you can plant 10 seeds in a square meter or 50 seeds in a square meter, and you end up with exactly the same number of seeds of yield, because the wheat plant can tell if it has resources. It'll produce 10 stems or 2 stems. So in modern agriculture, you aim for 2 stems for seed, and you plant 75 or 70 kilos an acre. Hectare, times 2.471, so you do the multiplication. But 210 kilos, isn't it, per hectare? Or you can plant at half that, and you get exactly the same yield. What counts? So planting more seed doesn't give you more yield. It's not like planting more carrots will give you more carrots. It doesn't work that way, because it's like a grass. This is a grass. This is wheat. The more you cut it, the more it produces short stems. So it's about the management of that resource. So I think that's how I interpret the forest Finns, that they put the seed very spread out, and it had a whole almost 2 seasons kind of to grow, because rye produces a lot of its stems in the autumn. That's why I've been racing to get rye planted 3 weeks ago. Wheat, I don't mind planting in October or November, but you've got to plant rye early because it produces its stems in the fall. And this is rye everywhere, whether that's Germany or the UK or anywhere, it's the same. So, so I think it was so spread out that they produced bushes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a higher yielding type of rye. It's about the management of that rye, if you see what I mean. And I actually got some of that rye, because there's a lot in the German gene bank, and I mixed it in with my rye. So I got rye from Scandinavia, from everywhere. Canada, Ireland, my old uncle in my village, everywhere. And I just put it in 20 about 20, almost 25 years ago. I put it all together and I just let it grow. So I'm now, I think it's my 24th harvest this year, and it's making whiskey and gin and vodka as well as flour and some beer. And it's all that time it's been crossing. So there's some of that finish in my, genetically, if you want to trace it, but from everywhere. In diversity, there is strength. And that's what my rye crop is. I've never, knock wood, I've never had a crop failure. I've had a bit lower, I've had human failures of farmers and myself. But in general, the crop's always been really, really good, really resilient. I get a pretty good yield every year. Yield? Well, that raises a whole different issue before I answer that question. Because I'm not trying to get maximal yield. These crops are adapted to very low nitrogen. All these ancient heritage crops are adapted to very low nitrogen. In a medieval farm, let's say 1500, they didn't have manure. They didn't store keep animals in the winter. There wasn't also any clover, so they had the nitrogen that was falling from the sky, and sheep would sometimes, if the sheep are eating in the forest and they bring them onto the field, they might drop a little bit of their shit there, but it was a very low nitrogen system. So these things were really good at scavenging nutrients and mycorrhizal in the soil. It was a difficult thing because they also took the straw off every year because that was fuel or for thatching. So there was very low organic matter from what I can see as well in medieval fields. So I think the average yield from what I could calculate, and I think I'm the only person to have direct evidence of the yield of a medieval crop. And I think it was it depends, somewhere around from 600 to 800 kilos per acre times 2.471. So not a lot. And the average yield of an organic farm, of an organic cereal field today is here in the UK, it's somewhere around 2 tons an acre. So maybe less than 3 tons if you're lucky. It's actually probably a bit lower than that. Of course, modern farming with nitrogen and glyphosate and herbicides and all that, you can obviously get double that, if 5, 6, 7 tons. But I think the average in the UK for chemical farming, regenerative chemical conventional farming, is I think the average is only about 3 tons and just over 3 tons. But so going back to what I said about early farming, how did those people, did they have crop rotation in the Neolithic period? I don't think anybody knows, but there's no evidence of cultivation. So I've been an organic farmer. And how do you do it? Sorry, to start with that. So conventional farming, this is answering your question about what the yield is, but the yield is lower. So I get about 1.2, I should answer it just directly. I get about 1.2 tons, which is far lower than an organic system using modern varieties. But it's not about the yield that counts, it's the productivity of the system. That's how I'm going to view it. Sorry, I'll answer. You had a question before
I was just wondering, you were saying there was no evidence of cultivation in the Neolithic period. Were you referring to grains or just overall?
I'm referring to grain.
Okay. Yeah.
Because, whether you're growing, there was obviously digging sticks and they probably ate roots and things. But when it comes to grain, I tried to say, even that, I don't know anything about grain, but I know a little bit more about grain than I know about I know nothing about animals, I'll tell you that. But I think I know a little bit about grain, and I've worked on those early sites. That doesn't mean I necessarily know anything either. It comes down to ecology and agronomy and all that, and I have tried to learn about that. But as far as I can see, there's no evidence of tillage, of ploughs, for example, until quite late.
Yeah. I mean, it's the question if you want to define cultivation as like tillage, right? If it's like the kind of controlled dissemination of a certain kind of more productive crop or something. Yeah, but it depends, I guess. Yeah,
no, that's exactly what is farming. What is agriculture? Is it just manipulation of an ecosystem that eventually, or at the end of it, where it's super intensive now? No, I agree. But a wild grass, what happens? How did farming happen? There are wild grasses, and they're annuals, not perennials. I do have perennial rye, I'll show you in the garden in a minute. But so you have an annual grass that grows, and at the top of it, when it's ripe, it breaks apart because it wants to reproduce. So the seeds just fall on the ground, and then it does it again, and so on, and so on, and so on. So the straw falls to the ground, it decays, it feeds the soil. There's a little nitrogen that falls from the sky. There's very little clover. There's very little nitrogen around there. Occasionally a gazelle comes by and eats it and drops a bit of shit perhaps. But there's not really, that's how it works. And there were wild grasses, stands of wild grasses that got more popular, more common when the climate changed around the little dryas, 10, 12,000 years ago. And suddenly there were lots of wild grasses. And there was already a cultural tradition of collecting wild grasses and turning them into porridge or flatbreads or feeding it to your babies or various things. And that was, quite nutritious. So what happens, climate gets drier, there's more and more grasses. But 1 in 10,000 plants, 1 in 10,000 wild grasses, the ear doesn't break apart. It stays there. So if you collect those, so let's say you come to your wild patch to collect for the winter, and the wind and the sun has already made it fall to the ground, and it's quite hard to collect it on the ground. If you come late, you've got more of those ones that didn't break apart. You collect those. Genetically, you've got a population that's more domesticated. If you plant them in a new area, that's the key, you fix those mutations, don't you, into the new population. And then you keep spreading, and eventually you have wheat. You have modern wheat. That's how I understand domestication. And that process, did that require cultivation? I don't see any evidence of that. You don't need it. I can take einkorn, which is the first wheat, or emmer, or spelt, or even modern bread wheat. If I throw it on the grass right here after you leave, I should have done it before you came, I'll have a wheat field. It'll grow. It's very competitive, and it doesn't need to be planted. And half of the crops I grow today, I just broadcast half. Maybe that's not technically correct, but I did it for 6 years on my fields here. I just broadcast the seed into clover, and then I mowed it. I chopped it, so it was sleeping under organic dew. It grows like crazy. You don't need to cultivate. And that's important for what I was going to say. So I want to finish what I was going to say. So conventional farming, forget it. Chemicals, fertilizer, destroying the soil, plowing. I'm not going there. That's evil, and it's going to destroy the planet. It's that simple. And I think grain production is one of the worst parts of that. I think, I have some very good friends who know a lot about livestock and dairying, small scale, sensitive dairying. I know I'm speaking to many vegans. But there's no such thing as sensitive animal maintenance. But he's doing quite a good job there, and he says a lot of them say you need animals for grain production. But I don't think that is how farming started. I don't think it involved animals. So anyway, I'm jumping around. So conventional farming, I don't want to do that. I don't want to use chemicals. What's the alternative? Organic. So how do you go grain organically? Well, in the UK, the Soil Association, this is where I have to be careful as I'm speaking into the camera. The Soil Association, which I've been a member of for many, many years, sets the rules about what is certified organic. And in the UK, the normal practice is 2 or 3 years of clover and grass to build fertility, a leguminous, fertility building lay, and then you plow that down. Now you can direct drill, but somehow you have to terminate that crop. And then you put in 1 crop of wheat, let's say, and hopefully the protein, and modern wheat mostly, and it needs a lot of protein, a lot of nitrogen. Modern crops need nitrogen. That's why they were bred. They were developed to use nitrogen, to convert nitrogen into grain or into carbohydrate, really. So, and they're short, so they can't compete, so you need herbicides, obviously not in the organic system, but they have shallower root systems, because when they made the stem shorter, they made the root shorter. So organic farmers in the UK use modern wheats, not designed for organic systems, and they're monocultures, so every plant in the field's identical, so they're not necessarily resilient. So if you're lucky, you get one crop of wheat and then all the nitrogen's gone. So you either produce another crop, let's say a 5-year rotation. That's the standard rotation, the farming system here. So you have 3 years of fertility building year, lay, 1 crop of wheat, and then usually barley or wheat as an animal feed. So to feed humans, you have 1 crop of wheat. And if you're lucky, that's 2 tons, maybe 1.8 tons. So in 5 years, you're producing 1.8 tons of grain. To me, that's not enough grain because I want to stop chemical grain farming. So I want to grow grain. I want 5 years of grain, and I don't want to use chemicals. So is that possible? Well, they tell you it's not possible. And if you do that you can't do that in a conventional system because you'll destroy the soil. Well, it's already destroyed, but it's illegal even because you still have to have a break crop once in a while. But you can't sustain continuous cropping. They'll tell you that. But I thought, well, in the Neolithic period, in nature, they weren't rotating. So what happened there? And they had very low nitrogen, crops adapted to low nitrogen. So all I'm doing, so the system I thought I would experiment with, and I did it for 6 years myself right here, and it worked. And I didn't push it to anyone until I felt it was working. And to me, it worked. So instead of having 3 years of clover, I just put clover underneath. And other people I know have been talking about living mulches. They'll call them different things. And people have played around with clover underneath. But it works. But the thing is, I find if you do it right and manage the clover, because the clover can be aggressive, but you can plant directly into the clover, no tillage. You can broadcast if you want, but you can direct drill, depending on the equipment you have, into the ground. And you have the clover underneath, and you can do that every year. You have massive biodiversity because you've got all the flowers and you don't get weeds, you don't get arable weeds because you're not disturbing the soil. So you just have clover. And I actually add weeds, rare weeds, to my crop because I want weeds, because I want to feed the bees and the bugs. So every year I can plant in the same field. I've got nitrogen falling from the sky. I've got clover making lots of nitrogen, and I chop the straw. So what I do is with my combine, which I just sold, it's this tall, so I harvest here, and I take the grain off, and then all that straw is chopped, and then you can broadcast the seed or direct drill into that stubble, we call it, the tall rubbish, and then mow it, cut it, and it's like a duvet of beautiful organic matter that slowly decays, and the wheat grows through it. It's like Fukuoka, Matsunobu Fukuoka, one straw. Although, I read that and I thought, well, how do you apply that to the UK? He had little fields of rice and about 300 volunteers to help him. And he used straw and he used chicken shit, didn't he, and stuff. But how do you do that on a commercial scale? And also, anyone know about this guy, what's his name, Marc Bonfils? French guy who talked about planting into clover in June. I got that idea kind of from there, but it didn't quite work in that way. Anyway, so it works for me. So now I'm getting, so in a conventional system, if you grow in a regenerative chemical conventional system, you get maybe maximum out of 5 years, you'll get maybe 3 years of grain. But let's say you get 3 tons. So you're getting 15 tons, maybe less because climate change, the crops are failing. So you get somewhere between 10 to 15, maybe a few more tons in total. Organic, you get 2. It's a big difference, 15 to 2, just for grain. Obviously, you're getting animals in the organic system, but I don't want animals. Well, I don't mind animals, but I don't have the equipment. I don't want to manage animals. I just want to grow grain. So the alternative is 15 for chemical, 10 to 15, but that's going to fail anyway. And 2 for organic, I get 1.2, maybe 1.3, but I get it every year. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I get 7 tons. So I'm getting 3 times the grain over a 5-year period than an organic grain production system, but I don't have animals. And what counts is how much money you make, I agree. but there's a value now for heritage grains, for these ancient grains, and I get a good price from the distillery and for flour. So actually it works for me. So I don't need to rotate. I don't need a fallow. I don't need a fertility building lay. I have that with clover in the field. So to me, it's like a permanent ecosystem, a permanent, more natural, manipulated Neolithic grassland ecosystem. You see where I'm trying to just mimic what people did in the past, and from what I can tell, and it works. It seems to work, and I get consistent quality of the grain. Like my protein is very stable every year. Instead of like from year to year you get like a wheat here like Paragon. It depends on the weather, doesn't it? Or if you modern, if you don't have the nitrogen, now the price of fertilizer is crazy and all that. So the quality of modern wheat is going like this. For organic, it's kind of like this. Mine's like this, and so the distillers making the whiskey were winning awards. They're saying there's something unusual about this grain. What is it? Well, I just mixed it. I don't really know. What varieties do you have? I have no idea. There's about 500. But I can make up some really nice names. But I got them out of the gene banks. But they're very similar to the ones I found in this thatched roof. So that room is full of this, of wheat. That's the national collection of ancient grains in the UK, and it's in really rough boxes because I stored them at my friends, and she turned it into a chicken coop, so they're covered with like chicken shit. And I want to do some DNA analysis so I can link the wheat from 1400 exactly to the wheat in the gene bank, and then recreate exactly a medieval crop.
And when we're talking 1400, like, when did the change actually start to happen? It was before, like, industrial fertilizer.
Which change? The change
away from the historical kind of wheat to what we have now.
There was the first clover. So the medieval system is 3 fields. Winter wheat, winter grain, rye or wheat, spring. It was a bread grain, wheat or rye, a drink grain, so oats or barley, and then a fallow, literally empty, where they stirred the soil. And I don't think that was very good for the soil either, but that's all they could do to stimulate mineralization and getting that nitrogen going. They didn't use legumes. If you go into Wikipedia and you say crop rotation in UK in the medieval period, they go, oh, they used peas and beans. No, they didn't grow them in a field. They grew them in a garden. They didn't have it. That's not rotation. They didn't have fertility building rotations. Clover comes in to help pastures, permanent pasture in like late 1500s, 1600s from Belgium, really. And then they have what they call the Norfolk four-course rotation, where they start doing rotations with clover. But that's early 1700s, 1730s, 1740s, where they start to do that. But that was to produce more animal meat for the Industrial Revolution, more dairy, more beef. And the grain production went down because it's only one of the 4 rotational crops then. So when they moved from medieval farming to industrial production, wheat production was dropping, in fact. But then they started, so the first fertilizer, they were bringing in guano, bird shit from Peru and all that for a while. In the late 1700s, early 1800s. Then in the 1840s, in the UK, at a place called Rothamsted, they invented superphosphate fertilizer. That was the first fertilizer in the UK that was created. And then later on, with the nitrogen process in the war and stuff, they invented nitrogen later. So it's actually fairly recent. Actually, it comes back to Germany again, doesn't it? It comes back to biodynamics, yeah, of course, because the soil was all, they were using, in the 1840s, they said you don't need to rotate. So they didn't rotate with legumes in the medieval period. By about 1740 in the UK, they start rotating with clover. And they did that for about 100 years. And then they said, oh, now we have chemicals, fertilizer, you don't need to rotate anymore. You can just use fertilizer, we don't need to rotate. And what happens? The soil dies. The soil's dead, of course, and no organic matter. And so then by the 1920s, 1930s, the soil is dead, and along comes biodynamics and, the beginnings of organics, whether you believe in the rest of the biodynamic or not. But that's the beginnings of organic, isn't it? And then the UK picks up from Germany organics, and in the UK, the Soil Association starts in the 1940s, and now we have organic farming with its very strict rules about rotation. So here I'm coming and saying, you don't need to rotate. What? You have to rotate or your soil will be dead. I said, no, I'm trying to actually be more natural than organic. There isn't only one Bible, one set of rules. I think you've always got to challenge the system a bit. So, but I've had a real problem. So the association says you're not organic. I said, I am organic. I'm not using chemicals. And they said, oh, your soil. You have to build your soil. I'm building the soil. The only thing that leaves my field is the grain. Everything else is chopped. So I'm sequestering carbon. It's all staying in the field. It's all being eaten by the worms. It's being drawn down into the soil. The clover's adding lots of good nutrients to the soil. I'm building the soil and I'm increasing biodiversity. I don't plow my fertility building ley into the soil. I'm not disturbing the soil. I'm inoculating my seeds with mycorrhizal powders. I'm actually really making a healthy soil. So don't tell me I'm not organic. But I'm not legally organic in the sense that I'm not rotating. Every other box, they go tick, tick, tick. No rotation. Sorry, no organic. And I was at a conference where they've told me that, and now they won't even answer my emails. But yeah, and there was an online discussion. I know this is being recorded, but I don't care. There was an online discussion about, you've heard about shume agriculture? It's a very Asian kind of, I think it's maybe Korean or not Japanese, maybe it's Japanese. Anyway, and they don't rotate. They keep growing the vegetables in the same bed and they don't worry about disease. And they say that the crop evolves a resistance. And I think for vegetables, it's not the same as grain. There are pests in the soil. But if you have genetic diversity, the key to disease is genetic diversity. If you have lots of genetic diversity, you don't get those diseases and you get better resistance pests. That's what I think. Anyway, so they said, so the Soil Association hosted a event about shume agriculture and how it's organic. And they don't rotate. And I said, well, hold on a minute. How come that is rotation and mine isn't? And they went, well, yeah. And then someone wrote in and said, you don't rotate your fruit trees, which I thought was really good. You don't rotate your orchard. No, you don't. What counts is, I shouldn't be so negative because I am an organic farmer and I believe in the organic movement and the Soil Association has done great things. But all things need to be challenged and changed. And there may be agroecological approaches to growing crops that we should think about. And most organic wheat in the UK is imported. We don't grow organic wheat in the UK. It's mostly imported from where? Ukraine and other places, France, maybe Germany. But I'm sure yours is organic, but some other places, who knows if it's really organic. I've heard some evidence of that. That's not necessarily organic. But we don't grow it because organic farming in the UK is about animals. It's about beef. It's about dairy. 3 years of clover, grass, and the animals graze it. 1 year of wheat, maybe if you can sell it for baking, and then barley or feed to animals. It's all about animals. It was always about animals. And I think maybe there are too many animals. And I like some animals, but I love cheese. That cheese you had was delicious there. But I think what we need to, they can graze grass and they can graze rough forests and waste and we can feed all that rubbish to pigs and stuff. That's fine. I think maybe that's a part of our system. It certainly has been for thousands of years, but that's a personal choice. And sheep maybe can graze the wheat fields and eat a few weeds and eat some of the clover, and that helps reduce the competition with the wheat. That's fine, but as long as the animals are, treated well enough, well, in the end we have to kill them. So that's a choice you have to make. But what we're doing now is clearly not sustainable. And the only way I can see to increase the grain production so I can stop chemical farming is to have a system that produces more grain than an organic rotational system. And that's my limitation right now. Modern chemical farmers, regenerative, conventional chemical farmers, they're really interested in this. They're saying, yeah, hey, I'll grow wheat for you. How much do you give me per acre? I don't care. I won't use chemicals. That's fine. They're okay to change. But I get resistance from organic farmers who say, oh, no, you have to do it this way. You go, okay, well, I think there may be another way. But I keep saying I'm not growing animals. That's the key difference. I just want to grow grain. But if you have 50 acres or 50 hectares, you know, right now in the UK, if you want to grow grain, because of the economies of scale, equipment, all that, you need 2,000 acres, so almost 1,000 hectares, to make it financially viable in the UK. Well, if you have 50 acres, what are you going to grow? How much grain can you grow in 50 acres? Well, you could theoretically do it if you have to rotate. If you're organic, if you have a 50 hectare organic farm and you have 5 fields, you're only producing, what, 10 acres of wheat every year. Well, if you have 50 and you're growing it continuously, then you might want to invest in equipment. Then maybe you can afford an old combine harvester and a bit of grain storage equipment. And 50 tons, or if I get 1.2 tons, I think I can get 1.5 if I do it correctly. I've had 2, by the way. If you grow this old wheat and old rye in an organic rotational system, I can get as much as a modern wheat. I get 2 tons, over 2 tons. That's all you get from a modern variety in an organic field. So they work in organic systems, but they produce so much straw. They're so tall, you get twice as much straw. So they work, but I don't want to use them in an organic system. So if I get one, you know, like I say, if I get 1.2, that's what I want to do. I want to grow grain without chemicals. I don't need to have animals, and I want to stop chemical farming. So it all comes back down to archaeology, strangely enough. It comes down to genetic diversity. And that's what gives the crop the resilience to deal with climate change, because it's going to get worse. Get ready. You know, it's definitely changing. So I've worked now with rye, and that population's doing really well. I'm adding a few Portuguese rye lines in and some Scandinavian ones in, because climate change is about extreme events and challenge. So I'm trying to always add more diversity, but it's already multiplying and doing its own thing. Wheat, it doesn't cross-pollinate, so you have to keep adding varieties in, and I'm doing the same. I'm still adding stuff to keep the population diverse. I'm just starting with oats, and I've got barley as well. That's a very mixed population that makes beautiful beer. And I'm really sorry I don't have any for you to drink. Next time. Well, next time you'll be.
2 questions. What do you mean by drilling into the clover? You actually mean drilling into the ground, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, you can have direct drills
Okay.
where you don't plow. It just forces it into the ground and puts the seed in. And but I learned this year. I got much to learn, but this year we had the drought, and the clover will take the moisture instead of the wheat plant or the rye plant or the barley plant. So we planted 70 acres of rye, but it's being recorded. It went in too late, let's just say. It was planted, I wanted it planted in September. It ended up being planted in November. So it didn't put root systems down very deep. It didn't have the time, and it was rye. And rye needs to go in early. They say rye in the dust and wheat in the mud or something. So you got to plant rye when it's dry and warm, early. Then it'll produce lots of stems. It went in too late. It didn't get a good root system, and the clover was quite competitive, quite aggressive. So then there was a drought. There was a drought, and it stole the moisture from the rye. It was useless. So eventually I said, mow it. And then it'll help next year. We'll have more fertility. But that was a failure that, I suppose it's climate failure. I don't think it's the grain that failed. It's a human failure and a climate failure combined. So clover, and maybe there's other things you can grow down there, but it has to be short. But then if you only harvest here, you don't have to harvest at the bottom. Well, then you can get away with plants that grow in here, like fodder beets and all sorts of weird plants you can grow in there. The key is organic matter and a natural slow-release source of nitrogen. Sorry, I should stop talking. I just keep going on. I'm sorry. Blah, 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 blah. No. Well, this is what I do. I'm hoping that's why you came, not just for the pizza. And the whiskey. Maybe I need some whiskey.
Another question. What do you think is better, like drilling or broadcasting? Because I think in Germany there were also tests with clover and wheat, but it didn't work out. I think I think the clover actually didn't make it. I think I'm not sure. Maybe the wheat was too tall. Maybe it was too small. So the clover wasn't able
Establish.
to establish. Maybe it was also because of the climate.
Thank you.
Maybe it was also because of the climate, because we didn't have rain, or it's not raining as much as in England. But I'm not sure why it didn't work out in Germany. That's
Here you have to. I've experimented. It's better to spread the clover on the ground in the spring,
okay.
and some people were doing it in the fall, and it didn't get established. What I find with all the experiments on clover have been done with modern wheat. I'm just starting some research projects to look at, tall wheat, because obviously they take more sunshine. So but the clover, goes down in the summer when the crop's growing, and it depends on the crop, and probably depends, fundamentally it depends on the crop, because it'll produce more stems depending on the density of the planting. But anyway, so the clover goes down in the summer, and then as soon as you cut it and mow it, poof, the clover goes like crazy, and it comes back. But then, so that's like, and then what do you do in the autumn? Well, you could put sheep on, you could mow it, because I want it mowed. I don't want the sheep to take the nitrogen away from the field. But now I'm getting worried that there's too much nitrogen from the clover. So I have to keep my nitrogen low, because these things will grow 3 meters tall, and then they'll fall over, and then there's no crop at all. So I worry about too much nitrogen, not enough nitrogen. So I think there's a lot yet to learn about managing the clover, but as long as the sheep stay on the field and they don't take that nitrogen away, I'm okay. But I'd rather do it without that. But then what's the alternative to mow it? That's fossil fuels. So I've got to use some diesel to chop it down to ground level. But I find it comes up. And I don't have problems with slugs. What do you call slugs and snails? Schnecken. Schnecken. Oh, that's a great word, schnecken. Too many schnecken. I love it. So the schnecken, I don't seem to have a problem. I've not really had a problem with schnecken, but modern fields have that, and they put on the slug pellets and all that. But I haven't really had a problem. But I have different farmers. Like some farmers are organic, and they're doing it in rotation, certified organic and rotation, and they're producing beautiful crops. I've got a few other farmers who are conventional, and the problem there, the soil isn't good enough. It's dead soil, and there's no organic matter, and it's light, and the only way you get a crop, they say, is if you use lots of fertilizer. Well, that's because the soil's dead. So they put mine in there, and it does probably better than modern crops without chemicals, but it's not good. It's not as good as I want it to be. You need healthy soil still. I'm having a few problems with that. But I think the clover is something you can manage, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but it is, in a dry year, it's very competitive, but it's a beautiful plant. It's all we need if we just learn how to manage it. And different farmers have different equipment for drilling, or some don't have any. But in my experience, if you're going to broadcast, you have to do it early, like in the summer, and like June, July, like I did for that field I was telling you about, and mow it. And then as long as you can get those wheat plants, probably maybe even mow it again or have it grazed. But wheat is really aggressive. It's really tough, and it grows 5 foot tall. They might compete in the beginning, in the spring, but once the wheat's above the clover, look out. So I think, you have to play with the sowing density. There's various factors, and maybe you harrow it. In the spring where you drag it, that really stimulates the cereal plant and knocks back the clover. Those are things we're going to test this year. But I think there are ways of managing it.
Do you use different kind of clover?
Short clover. There's small, middle, and large-leaved clovers, and different farmers have used different ones. But I'm trying to use what we call the wild Kent, the small one, which is genetically diverse.
Which flower color?
It's white.
White clover.
Never red clover. Well, I've not used red clover. It's so aggressive and it's so tall, but the rye is tall, but I think the red clover will outcompete the cereals, so I don't use red clover. I realize when people are talking about the first clover into the UK in this Norfolk four-course rotation I was telling you about in the 1800s, they were referring to red clover. So they weren't having it as an understory. And obviously they didn't have clover as an understory in the Neolithic period. So when I'm going on about like early agriculture, I mean, I'm taking some lessons from different historical times and mixing them all up. So I think this approach is mimicking nature, but it's obviously not exactly what was done. But then what's a farm field? It's not exactly.
Do you try to put some other kinds in that have deeper root or something like this?
Legumes, you mean? Or any plants,
Yeah,
any
any
plants.
plants.
Well, someone put chicory in, which is a nightmare because it's a perennial, or certainly biennial, perennial, and it's a nightmare. It's so tall and so tough. You know, maybe you could put in roots like sugar beet, or I don't know, something with a big fodder beet that would help break up the soil, or
Lucerne, Espasette, I don't know the English words.
Alfalfa?
alfalfa. It's aggressive. I haven't done all those experiments, but all I know is that clover is short, and also if I want to cut it for thatching straw, I need it short, because I think
It's easy, but it's not deep enough, I think.
I know. No, I agree. Well, probably not. That's fine. And I want to pump carbon in through the roots into the soil. I agree. So, but what do you use that isn't going to be highly competitive against cereals? I ended up at Reading University, and it was all GM crops and all of that. And I got so fed up with that as well. I spent, 6 years there doing my PhD research at Reading, all on this. And when I went into the department and said, look, you know, medieval land races, genetic diversity, sustainable grain production, it's scientific, you know, we can have diversity. They went, you should go in the history department, John, that's silly. You know, that is not farming, that is not agriculture, that is not science. And I've never had any funding since then except one source, the Prince of Wales. King Charles, and he's always been supportive. And I grow on the Queen's estate in Sandringham, where you were near, and Highgrove and all those places. But the leading agricultural university in the UK, one of the top leading ones, which is Reading, didn't want to know anything about this. The whole department was funded by Monsanto, you know, Agrivo, Bayer, all those companies. And they didn't want to know about this stuff. And yet, I think, so, you know, you're not going to breed your way out of climate change. You know, they say, oh, we're going back and taking ancestors of wheats and we're breeding that in to add resilience. No, you're creating monocultures. It's still a monoculture. You know, a GM is just as toxic as GM food might be. It's just an extreme monoculture. And you're going to spend, 10 million pounds developing some monoculture variety. Well, I want 500 types of wheat. If you have 500 GM crops in the field, varieties in the field, and you can prove every one of them safe, then you've got some diversity. You know, if you really needed to grow GM crops to feed the world, I want to feed the world, so I'd probably do it. But they aren't going to feed the world, and that's not the problem. And I'm not going to grow it because I think they're toxic and dangerous. But you know, science goes back again. I say to science should be at the service of humanity. And lessons from the past. There are many lessons from the past we have yet to learn. Our gene banks are full of different crops, like carrots or lettuce, any crop you talk about. There are 10,000 types of carrots in the gene bank. And people say, oh, we need to breed new carrots for organic production systems. Well, there are 10,000 different types right now in the gene bank. Have you grown them? Maybe some of those are good for carrot production. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of different types of wheat out there. So mix them all up, put them in your field, grow them for 5 years, and the ones that grow best are going to do better. And, you know, oh, they won't bake well enough. They will bake well enough. They bake very well. And remember, the whole, you know, if you want healthy bread, you really have to use a sourdough, you know, lactic acid baking process. That's what our ancestors did for 10,000 years. Now we use some modern wheat baking methods, you know, called the shorty wood baking process, which is just pretty much chemical bread. It's not even fermented. We're not cows. We can't eat raw wheat. But that's what we're doing. Our modern bread's raw wheat. No wonder we're all getting ill with celiac disease and gluten and intolerance and all that. But the key thing is that the sourdough baking process breaks down gluten. It doesn't make for fluffy bread. So it doesn't matter, in a sense, how much gluten so how much nitrogen you have in your flour, because it breaks it down. You know, a sourdough baker knows how to work it to trap the air in, and then you have steam rise in the oven. It makes lovely, delicious, chewy bread. But it's not just based on the gluten. And the whole obsession with modern wheat production is gluten. You need protein, gluten. That comes from nitrogen. Therefore, we need high nitrogen. Well, a sourdough breaks down the gluten anyways. You don't need it. You can have low protein, low nitrogen wheat and make beautiful French bread, you know. Europeans have generally saved your bread traditions more than Britain did. Early 1800s, that's why rye disappeared in 1790s, because you had the first bakeries pushing yeast bread into villages and farms, you know, and people stopped growing rye. And we lost our bread traditions. So now we have to look to California and Paris and to get our bread traditions back, which is happening, which is great. But you know that you've held on in yours, and you grow more rye. You eat more rye in Germany than most places because you still have some concept of what decent bread is. Someone's got to press the stop button. I hope it's kind of roughly what you wanted. Well, not, you haven't talked, I did all the talking, but we wanted, this is what I do. I don't know if that's why you came, and maybe that's not what you expected, but this is what I do. And I've spent 30 years going to gene banks, getting these seeds out, growing them in a little plot in the garden, and then a bigger plot and a bigger plot, cutting it by hand. You know, I was going to flail it by hand. I got to get the grain out. You know, I had no money because I left Reading. I've never had resources to do this. Selling a little bit of flour, but the world has changed. And now I think maybe those types of crops, really crops of our ancestors, but modern versions, are becoming the thing we need.